In early September 1942, United States Marine Corps units occupied defensive positions around the Lunga airfield on Guadalcanal. The perimeter extended irregularly through jungle, grassland, and broken terrain shaped by ridges, streams, and coconut plantations. The airfield, known operationally as Henderson Field, was under constant observation and intermittent bombardment from Japanese naval and air forces. Marine defensive dispositions were adjusted daily in response to reconnaissance reports, patrol contacts, and logistical limitations. Units were understrength due to combat losses, disease, and the effects of continuous operations since the initial landings in August. Within the southern sector of the perimeter, a narrow ridge system extended north to south between the Lunga River and the jungle-covered hills to the south. This feature was identified on marine maps as a dominant terrain axis that could provide covered approach routes toward the airfield if seized by an attacking force. The ridge consisted of coral spurs, kunai grass slopes, and tree-covered ravines, with limited vehicle access and restricted visibility. Marine patrols operating in the area reported signs of enemy movement, including discarded equipment, boot prints, and disturbed vegetation, indicating the presence of organized Japanese forces south of the perimeter. On September 11, 1942, Marine intelligence sections received reports from coastwatchers and aerial reconnaissance indicating that elements of the Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade were moving toward the Lunga perimeter. Estimates varied, but available information suggested that several battalions were assembling for a coordinated night attack. Marine commanders issued orders to reinforce the southern sector, particularly the ridge line later designated as the primary avenue of approach. Defensive preparations included the placement of barbed wire, registration of mortar and artillery fires, and the redistribution of ammunition stocks forward. The forces assigned to hold the ridge consisted primarily of the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion, reinforced by elements of the 5th Marines. The combined strength of these units was approximately 840 officers and enlisted men present for duty. Many had been engaged in continuous operations since the landings and were carrying reduced rations. Weapons available included M1903 and M1 rifles, Browning automatic rifles, machine guns, 60mm and 81mm mortars, limited quantities of hand grenades, and a small number of light artillery pieces positioned to support the sector from within the perimeter. Defensive positions were established along the crest and forward slopes of the ridge. Fighting holes were shallow due to coral substrate, and overhead cover was minimal. Fields of fire were cleared where possible, though dense vegetation limited observation beyond short distances. Communication between units relied on field telephones, runners, and prearranged signal flares. Artillery support was coordinated through forward observers who had registered likely approaches during daylight hours. During the afternoon of September 12, Japanese artillery and mortar fire increased in intensity against the southern perimeter. Shells impacted along the ridge and in rear areas, disrupting communications and causing casualties among support units. Marine units remained in position and continued preparations as daylight diminished. Patrols sent forward encountered increasing resistance and reported enemy forces moving into assault positions within the jungle south of the ridge. As night fell, the perimeter was placed on full alert. Units stood to at dusk, weapons manned, and ammunition distributed to forward positions. The sound of movement in the jungle increased after dark, accompanied by intermittent shouting and the noise of equipment. Shortly after midnight, Japanese forces initiated their attack with coordinated infantry assault supported by mortars and machine guns. Initial contact occurred along the forward slopes of the ridge, where Japanese infantry advanced in dispersed formations, using the cover of darkness and vegetation. Marine outposts engaged with small arms fire and grenades. The attackers pressed forward, attempting to locate gaps in the defensive line. Japanese troops advanced in successive waves, maintaining pressure despite casualties. Marine defenders responded with rifle fire, automatic weapons, and prearranged mortar concentrations. As the engagement intensified, Japanese units attempted to envelop the ridge by moving through adjacent ravines and drawing marine fire away from the crest. Several positions were overrun or temporarily penetrated, leading to close-quarters fighting in darkness. Marine units conducted local counterattacks to restore the line, using grenades and bayonets where necessary. Communications between companies were intermittent due to damaged telephone lines, requiring runners to relay orders and reports under fire. Throughout the night, Japanese forces continued to assault the ridge from multiple directions. Mortar fire impacted along the crest and reverse slopes, causing casualties among command posts and support personnel. Marine artillery fired continuously in support, expending significant quantities of ammunition. Forward observers adjusted fire based on sound and limited visual cues, coordinating with infantry units to prevent friendly fire incidents. By early morning on September 13, Japanese attacks diminished in intensity. Marine units conducted hasty reorganization, redistributing ammunition and evacuating wounded where possible. Casualty collection was conducted under intermittent fire, with corpsmen and stretcher-bearers moving along the ridge and rear slopes. The defensive line remained intact, though several positions had been reduced in strength. Daylight revealed numerous Japanese casualties on the forward slopes and in the ravines below the ridge. Marine patrols advanced cautiously to confirm enemy withdrawal, encountering wounded Japanese soldiers and abandoned equipment. Defensive positions were reinforced, and preparations were made for the likelihood of renewed attacks after nightfall. During the day of September 13, Japanese forces regrouped south of the perimeter. Marine intelligence reports indicated continued enemy movement and the presence of additional units preparing for another assault. Marine commanders adjusted defensive plans, shifting reserves and reinforcing critical sectors along the ridge. Ammunition resupply was conducted under sporadic artillery fire, with supply parties moving forward during lulls. As darkness fell on the evening of September 13, Marine units again stood to in anticipation of renewed attacks. Defensive fires were registered, and units prepared for close combat. Shortly after nightfall, Japanese artillery and mortars resumed firing against the ridge and surrounding areas. The intensity of bombardment exceeded that of the previous night, with sustained fire impacting defensive positions and rear areas. Following the bombardment, Japanese infantry launched coordinated assaults against the ridge. Attacks were directed along the crest and through adjacent ravines, with units advancing in depth. Marine defenders engaged with small arms and automatic weapons, using prearranged mortar and artillery fires to disrupt enemy formations. The fighting quickly devolved into close-range engagements, with visibility limited to a few meters. Japanese units succeeded in penetrating portions of the defensive line along the ridge crest, forcing Marine units to fall back to secondary positions. Commanders committed reserves to seal breaches and restore the line. Machine gun sections repositioned under fire to cover likely avenues of approach. Mortar teams continued firing despite casualties, adjusting their positions as enemy troops closed in. Throughout the night, the ridge was subjected to repeated assaults. Japanese troops advanced despite heavy losses, using grenades and bayonets in attempts to dislodge Marine defenders. Marine units responded with concentrated fire and local counterattacks, often conducted by small groups acting on immediate necessity. Ammunition shortages became acute in several sectors, requiring redistribution under fire. Artillery support from within the perimeter remained continuous. Guns fired at close ranges, with shells impacting within short distances of friendly positions. Forward observers coordinated fires based on sound and reports from infantry units, adjusting as the battle shifted along the ridge. Illumination rounds were used intermittently to disrupt enemy movement, revealing advancing troops on the slopes. As the night progressed, Marine units experienced increasing fatigue and casualties. Command posts were relocated as enemy fire rendered positions untenable. Medical personnel continued to treat wounded under fire, using improvised aid stations along the reverse slopes. Evacuation routes were exposed to enemy fire, complicating casualty movement. By the early hours of September 14, Japanese assaults began to lose coordination. Attacks became less frequent and less concentrated, though sporadic fighting continued along the ridge. Marine units maintained their positions, conserving ammunition and maintaining security. Patrols were held in place until daylight to prevent further penetrations. At first light, Marine units conducted limited advances to reoccupy forward positions and assess the situation. Japanese forces had withdrawn from immediate contact, leaving behind casualties and equipment. Defensive positions along the ridge were re-established, and units conducted reorganization and resupply as conditions permitted. Throughout the 2 nights of fighting, Marine units along the ridge maintained their positions against repeated assaults by larger Japanese forces. The engagement was characterized by close-range combat, limited visibility, and sustained pressure on defensive positions. Actions were conducted in accordance with existing orders and immediate tactical requirements, with adjustments made in response to evolving conditions on the ground. The area south of the ridge remained under observation as Marine units continued to prepare for further enemy activity. Patrols were dispatched to monitor Japanese movements, and defensive works were improved where possible. The perimeter around the Lunga airfield remained intact as operations continued on Guadalcanal. Following the withdrawal of Japanese forces at daylight on September 14, 1942, Marine units holding the southern ridge conducted consolidation activities under intermittent artillery and mortar fire. Defensive positions were reoccupied or adjusted based on damage sustained during the night fighting. Surviving fighting holes were deepened where possible, and new positions were scraped into the coral substrate using entrenching tools, bayonets, and improvised implements. Units redistributed remaining ammunition, concentrating automatic weapons and grenades at points previously subjected to penetration attempts. Medical evacuation continued throughout the morning. Wounded personnel were moved by stretcher along narrow trails to aid stations within the perimeter. Corpsmen operated under limited supplies, treating wounds sustained from small arms fire, shrapnel, and blast effects. Several aid stations had been struck during the night bombardment and were relocated to more protected areas. Casualty records were compiled as circumstances allowed, though accurate counts were delayed due to ongoing operations. Marine intelligence personnel collected documents, weapons, and personal effects left by Japanese soldiers in front of the ridge. These materials were forwarded to intelligence sections for examination. Patrols reported that Japanese units had withdrawn southward into the jungle and ravine systems, leaving behind scattered groups of wounded and isolated soldiers. Orders were issued to avoid unnecessary engagements while maintaining observation of likely approach routes. Throughout September 14, Japanese artillery continued sporadic shelling of the southern perimeter. Shells impacted along the ridge and in rear areas, disrupting supply efforts and causing additional casualties among support units. Marine artillery responded with counter-battery fire when firing points could be identified. Air activity increased during daylight hours, with Marine aircraft operating from Henderson Field conducting reconnaissance and limited strikes against suspected enemy assembly areas south of the perimeter. Marine commanders conducted assessments of unit strength and defensive readiness. The combined radar and parachute elements had suffered significant casualties over the 2 nights of fighting, reducing effective strength. Reinforcements from other Marine units within the perimeter were limited due to ongoing commitments along the Matanacoa River and coastal sectors. Orders emphasized holding existing ground and preparing for further enemy action. Japanese forces south of the perimeter reorganized during the day. Intelligence reports based on intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations indicated that surviving elements of the attacking units were regrouping and receiving orders. Supplies were limited, and movement was constrained by terrain and Marine air activity. Despite losses, Japanese units maintained positions within striking distance of the ridge. As night fell on September 14, Marine units again stood to at dusk. Defensive fires were registered, and listening posts were established forward of the main line. The night passed with reduced enemy activity compared to the previous 2 nights. Occasional probing movements were detected and engaged by small arms fire. Mortar fire occurred intermittently but did not develop into a coordinated assault. On September 15, Marine patrols advanced cautiously beyond the ridge to assess enemy dispositions. Contact was limited to small groups of Japanese soldiers retreating southward. Patrols reported abandoned equipment, including rifles, machine guns, ammunition, and personal gear. No organized resistance was encountered within immediate proximity to the ridge. Patrols withdrew before nightfall in accordance with standing orders. Supply efforts continued throughout the day. Ammunition, water, and rations were moved forward by carrying parties under the threat of artillery fire. Food supplies remained limited, with units receiving reduced rations. Water shortages persisted, requiring rationing and the use of collected rainwater where available. Maintenance of weapons was conducted as conditions allowed, with emphasis on cleaning and repairing automatic weapons and mortars that had been heavily used. Marine engineers and support units improved defensive works along the ridge. Barbed wire obstacles were repaired or extended, and additional fields of fire were cleared using hand tools and explosives. Mortar positions were repositioned to improve coverage of likely approach routes. Artillery fire plans were reviewed and adjusted based on observations from the previous engagements. Japanese air and naval activity continued to pose a threat to Henderson Field and the perimeter. Bombardments by aircraft and naval guns occurred intermittently, requiring Marine units to take cover and disrupting ongoing work. Despite these actions, flight operations continued when possible, supporting reconnaissance and limited offensive missions. During the following days, the southern sector remained relatively quiet compared to earlier engagements. Marine units maintained a heightened state of readiness, conducting regular patrols and maintaining defensive positions. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese forces were shifting focus to other sectors of the perimeter and to operations along the Matanako River. The actions along the ridge during the nights of 12 to 14 September were documented in unit reports and after-action summaries compiled as time permitted. These reports recorded the sequence of engagements, ammunition expenditures, casualties, and observed enemy tactics. Maps were updated to reflect changes in defensive positions and terrain features identified during the fighting. Marine units continued to occupy the ridge as part of the Lunga perimeter. The area remained a key defensive feature due to its terrain and proximity to Henderson Field. Preparations continued for further engagements as the campaign on Guadalcanal progressed, with units adapting to the conditions imposed by terrain, climate, and ongoing enemy activity. Operations on Guadalcanal remained fluid, with Marine units adjusting dispositions in response to enemy movements and logistical constraints. The southern ridge remained under Marine control, with defensive measures maintained and improved as circumstances allowed. The perimeter continued to be held as operations proceeded into the latter half of September 1942. By mid-September 1942, Marine units holding the southern sector of the Lunga perimeter remained deployed along the ridge system south of Henderson Field. Defensive routines followed a regular cycle dictated by daylight reconnaissance, nighttime alerts, and limited opportunities for rest. Units rotated sentries, repaired positions, and conducted patrols within assigned sectors. The terrain continued to restrict movement and visibility, and all activity was carried out with attention to concealment due to the continued presence of Japanese forces in the surrounding jungle. Japanese artillery and mortar fire persisted at irregular intervals. Shelling was often conducted during early morning or late afternoon hours, targeting known or suspected Marine positions, supply routes, and command posts. Impacts caused further degradation of defensive works, requiring repeated repairs. Marine counter-battery fire was employed when firing positions could be estimated, though dense vegetation and frequent displacement of Japanese weapons limited effectiveness. Marine intelligence sections compiled information from patrol reports, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations. Reports indicated that Japanese units previously engaged along the ridge had suffered heavy losses and were no longer capable of immediate large-scale assaults in that sector. However, intelligence assessments also noted the arrival of additional Japanese forces elsewhere on the island, suggesting that pressure on the perimeter would continue. Throughout the 16th and the 17th of September, Marine patrols advanced cautiously south and southwest of the ridge to determine the extent of Japanese withdrawal. Patrols moved in small units, maintaining contact with adjacent elements and returning before nightfall. Encounters were limited to isolated Japanese soldiers and small groups attempting to evade capture. Several skirmishes occurred, resulting in brief exchanges of fire. Captured personnel were evacuated to the rear for interrogation. Supply conditions remained constrained. Naval resupply efforts were subject to Japanese air and surface interdiction, resulting in irregular deliveries. Ammunition levels were restored to minimum defensive requirements, though reserves remained limited. Food rations continued to be reduced, and fresh water remained scarce. Units relied on captured Japanese supplies in some instances, following inspection by medical personnel. Disease and exhaustion affected unit strength. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections were prevalent. Medical personnel recorded increasing numbers of non-battle casualties, reducing effective manpower. Despite these conditions, units maintained defensive readiness, with limited opportunities for relief or rotation. Japanese air activity increased intermittently, particularly against Henderson Field. Bombing raids disrupted flight operations and caused casualties among airfield personnel and nearby units. Marine aircraft continued to operate when conditions allowed, conducting reconnaissance, air defense, and limited strikes against identified enemy positions and supply routes. In the southern sector, defensive improvements continued. Engineers and infantry units worked to strengthen positions along the ridge, improving drainage, camouflage, and overhead cover where materials permitted. Barbed wire obstacles were extended, and additional trip flares were placed along likely approach routes. Mortar and machine gun positions were adjusted to provide overlapping fields of fire. Commanders conducted periodic inspections of forward positions to assess readiness and morale. Orders emphasized fire discipline, maintenance of weapons, and conservation of ammunition. Training activities were limited due to operational demands but included rehearsals of night defense procedures and casualty evacuation under fire. Japanese forces south of the perimeter remained active but did not attempt further large-scale assaults against the ridge during this period. Movement was detected primarily at night, with small units probing marine positions and withdrawing when engaged. Mortar fire accompanied some of these movements but lacked the coordination observed during earlier attacks. By late September, Marine units received reports of Japanese activity shifting toward the western sectors near the Mataniko River. The southern ridge sector was designated as a secondary threat axis, though units remained in place due to its proximity to Henderson Field. Reserves were limited, and any reduction in defensive strength was considered unacceptable given ongoing enemy capabilities. Documentation of the earlier engagements continued. Unit diaries and situation reports recorded details of nightly contacts, ammunition expenditures, and logistical issues. These documents were forwarded through command channels as conditions allowed, contributing to ongoing operational planning. Weather conditions affected operations. Heavy rains increased mud and impeded movement along supply trails. Water collected in fighting holes, requiring continuous bailing and repair. Equipment suffered from corrosion and moisture damage, necessitating constant maintenance efforts. Despite reduced enemy pressure, the southern ridge remained an active defensive position. Listening posts and observation positions were maintained nightly. Patrols continued to monitor approaches and report any changes in enemy activity. Units remained prepared for renewed assaults, maintaining weapons at the ready and conducting nightly alerts at dusk. As September progressed, the situation on Guadalcanal remained contested. Marine units along the ridge continued to perform defensive duties under conditions of uncertainty, limited resources, and ongoing threat. Operations proceeded without interruption, with all actions conducted in accordance with standing orders and immediate tactical requirements. On September 14, 1942, after daylight, reports from forward positions on the southern ridge indicated that organized Japanese assaults had ceased and that enemy movement in the immediate foreground had reduced to scattered individuals and small groups moving under cover of vegetation. Marine patrols moved short distances beyond the forward edge to confirm withdrawal and to locate wounded personnel. Captured documents and equipment were gathered and sent to the rear for examination. Defensive positions were reoccupied in depth along the crest and reverse slope, and machine guns were shifted to cover the ravines and low ground that had carried the main approaches during the night fighting. Throughout September 14, Japanese artillery fire continued intermittently, directed against the ridge line, nearby draws, and areas within the Lunga perimeter used as supply routes and aid stations. Shelling disrupted work details and delayed resupply forward. Marine artillery units fired scheduled defensive concentrations along likely avenues of approach south of the ridge and executed counter-battery missions when observers could fix probable firing areas. Forward observers reported difficulty in establishing precise enemy weapon locations due to jungle canopy, displacement of enemy firing points, and limited ground observation from the ridge. Aircraft operating from Henderson Field conducted reconnaissance and intermittent strikes during available weather and serviceability windows, with the main effort directed against suspected assembly areas and movement routes south and west of the perimeter. In the forward sector, casualty collection continued as the line stabilized. Aid stations operated with limited medical supplies, and corpsmen treated wounds under continuing shellfire. Stretcher evacuation moved casualties rearward along narrow trails under the cover of terrain folds. Records of killed, wounded, and missing were compiled as units accounted for personnel following the night engagements, with totals updated as delayed reports were received from small groups that had been temporarily separated during the fighting. During the same period, Japanese forces south of the ridge reorganized in the jungle. Reports derived from subsequent contacts and recovered material indicated that units that had conducted the main assaults had withdrawn in a disordered condition, with survivors gathering in small groups to locate leaders and move to designated rally areas. Some wounded remained in the forward approaches and ravines, and isolated Japanese soldiers were encountered by Marine patrols over the next several days. On September 15, Marine patrol activity increased in the southern ridge sector. Patrols moved out before midday and returned before dusk, advancing along spurs and through ravines that led into the jungle south of the crest. Contact was limited and irregular. In some cases, patrols found abandoned packs, ammunition, and discarded weapons. In other cases, brief exchanges of rifle fire occurred with small enemy groups moving away from the perimeter. Patrol reports described signs of hurried movement, including recently broken vegetation, improvised litters, and trails marked by dropped equipment. Recovered items were collected when practicable and otherwise marked by location for later examination. Defensive preparations continued without interruption. Working parties extended or repaired wire where material was available, placed additional trip flares on short approaches to the crest, and improved fields of fire where clearing could be conducted without exposing positions to observation. In the coral substrate, deep entrenchment remained limited, and overhead cover was constructed with available logs, sandbags, and corrugated material when it could be moved forward. Machine gun positions were reinforced and adjusted to provide overlapping fire across the low ground between the ridge and the Lunga River as well as along the southern approaches that had carried the previous assaults. Supply conditions remained restrictive. Ammunition expenditure during the 2 nights of fighting had reduced unit stocks, particularly for machine guns, mortars, and grenades. Resupply forward was executed by carrying parties along trails exposed to shellfire, and the movement of ammunition frequently halted during bombardment. Rations remained short, with some units operating on reduced daily issue. Water remained limited and was distributed by canteens and containers moved forward by carrying parties, with consumption controlled by unit orders. Weapon maintenance was conducted continuously due to humidity, mud, and high rates of fire. Cleaning materials were limited, and units improvised with available cloth and oil to keep weapons serviceable. Japanese movement westward from the ridge sector was detected by a combination of patrol observation, captured material, and aerial reconnaissance. Marine situation reports noted increasing indications that enemy survivors and elements not committed on the ridge were shifting toward the Matanikaw Valley and the coastal area west of the Lunga perimeter. The movement was assessed as occurring on foot through difficult terrain, with wounded carried by litter and with heavy equipment reduced by abandonment along the route. Reports described discarded items increasing in quantity as distance from the ridge increased, including helmets, packs, ammunition boxes, and, in some locations, rifles. On the morning of September 16, Marine patrols pushed farther into the southern approaches than in preceding days, with orders to determine the direction of enemy withdrawal and to identify any organized defensive positions forming within immediate striking distance of the perimeter. Patrols moved along ridgelines to avoid swampy low ground and to maintain orientation. Contact remained limited to scattered individuals and small groups. Several wounded Japanese soldiers were located in ravines and were either captured when possible or left under guard for later evacuation if security conditions permitted. Patrols reported that some enemy personnel were without food and were moving slowly, and that organized enemy formations were no longer present within the near approaches to the ridge. Within the perimeter, command channels issued instructions to maintain readiness while reconstituting depleted units. The units that had held the ridge during the main attacks were assessed for effective strength, and personnel were redistributed to fill critical positions. Replacement of key weapons crews was carried out using available personnel from rear details and from nearby units when permitted by overall defensive requirements. Mortar sections were reissued rounds from limited stocks, and fire plans were reviewed to ensure that prearranged concentrations covered the draws and slopes that had carried the heaviest assaults. Artillery units continued to register close defensive fires, and liaison between infantry and artillery elements was reinforced by assignment of additional runners and confirmation of alternate signal procedures in the event of telephone line disruption. Enemy shelling continued intermittently on the 16th and the 17th of September. The pattern included short bombardments directed at the ridge and at rear areas used for supply and command functions. Marine artillery responded with harassing fire along suspected enemy routes south and west of the ridge. Aircraft sorties were conducted when possible, with reconnaissance flights observing movement trails and potential bivouac areas in the jungle and along the western approaches. Flight operations were frequently interrupted by Japanese air raids against Henderson Field, which forced personnel into cover and damaged facilities and aircraft when strikes achieved hits. In the forward sector, Marine units maintained listening posts each night. These posts were placed forward of the main line in concealed positions, with orders to detect movement, identify direction of approach, and provide early warning. Posts were rotated to reduce fatigue and to limit predictability. Contact during these nights consisted mostly of sporadic rifle fire and occasional grenade incidents when enemy individuals approached close to the line. No coordinated enemy assault developed in the ridge sector during these nights, and reports indicated that enemy activity in that area had shifted to movement and small probing contacts. By September 18, Marine reporting placed increased emphasis on enemy activity west of the perimeter. Situation maps and daily summaries noted continuing indications of Japanese concentration in the coastal sector near the Matanikawa River and beyond. The southern ridge sector remained under observation and was maintained as a fully manned defensive position, but the immediate pressure previously applied against it was assessed as reduced. Patrols continued to report abandoned equipment trails leading westward, with evidence of wounded being carried and of heavy items being discarded. During this period, the process of documenting the 2 nights of fighting proceeded in unit diaries and action reports compiled under field conditions. Company and battalion records included timelines of contact, approximate enemy directions, ammunition expenditure, and casualty counts as known at the time. Maps were annotated to show positions held at dusk, lines of withdrawal to secondary positions during penetrations, locations of machine gun displacement, and points where local counterattacks were conducted. These records were forwarded through command channels when transport and communications permitted. On the 19th and the 20th of September, patrol operations continued with emphasis on confirming the absence of organized enemy formations immediately south of the ridge. Patrols moved out in daylight, avoided extended halts, and withdrew prior to dusk. Small contacts occurred intermittently, usually consisting of short exchanges with Japanese stragglers or small groups moving away from the perimeter. Some enemy dead were located along movement routes, and equipment was recovered when it could be carried without reducing security. Patrols reported that jungle trails showed heavy foot traffic in previous days, but that recent movement in the ridge approaches had decreased, with tracks and signs indicating that the main enemy movement had shifted westward. Defensive life on the ridge returned to a routine characterized by stand-to at dusk and dawn, weapon maintenance, limited sleep, and continuous attention to security. Working parties continued strengthening positions. Drainage was improved where possible due to periodic rain, which flooded shallow fighting holes and increased mud on the slopes. The ridge line remained exposed to shell fragments during bombardments, and personnel remained in covered positions when fire began, returning to weapons as soon as the shelling lifted. Marine commanders maintained the ridge under direct control because of its proximity to the airfield and because of the approach routes it covered. Machine guns and mortars remained sighted to interdict the ravines and open ground between the ridge and the river. Artillery continued to maintain registered concentrations for night defense. Ammunition allocations were adjusted to maintain minimum levels forward, with instructions emphasizing controlled fire and conservation of grenades and mortar rounds. Japanese forces in the wider Guadalcanal area continued their movement and reorganization after the unsuccessful assaults, with information reaching Marine units through aerial observation, patrol reports, and intelligence examination of captured material. The immediate ridge sector remained in Marine hands, with no further massed night attack developing there during this interval. Marine units continued to patrol, maintain defensive positions, and conduct supply and casualty evacuation under intermittent bombardment as operations proceeded into the latter part of September 1942. On September 14, 1942, after first light, Marine units on the ridge line south of Henderson Field remain in place and maintain security while re-establishing positions disrupted during the night. Small groups move forward under cover to determine whether organized enemy bodies remain immediately in front of the line. In the ravines and along the approaches used during the assaults, scattered enemy dead and abandoned equipment are observed. Items that can be carried without reducing local security are collected and sent to the rear. Where forward positions have been flattened by shellfire or trampled during close contact, new shallow pits are scraped and existing holes are reoccupied. Machine guns are shifted by short distances to restore fields of fire across the draws and the low ground between the ridge and the Lunga River, and to cover the southern spurs that had carried repeated approaches during the night engagements. During the morning and afternoon, the ridge sector receives intermittent sniper fire and occasional shelling. Working parties improve overhead cover where material can be dragged forward. In the coral and compacted ground, deeper digging remains slow, and parapets are raised with sandbags, logs, and coral rubble. Wire is repaired where it has been cut or pulled apart, and trip flares are reset along short approach lanes that lead into the crest. Ammunition is redistributed from positions that retain surplus to positions that report shortages, with small carrying parties moving along trails that have been kept under observation for enemy fire. Mortar squads maintain readiness and adjust their positions to improve coverage of the ravines that had been used as covered routes during the night. Within the perimeter, battalion and regimental commanders compile immediate situation reports based on message traffic, runner reports, and first light reconnaissance. Accounting for personnel continues as small groups return from temporary displacement during the night or report from positions that had been isolated during close contact. Casualty reporting remains incomplete during the day as bodies are located and evacuated and as wounded are moved rearward. Aid stations continue operating with limited supplies and under the threat of intermittent shelling. Corpsmen treat casualties from rifle fire, fragmentation wounds, and blast effects, then coordinate movement rearward by litter where routes remain open. Enemy activity during the day is reduced compared to the previous night. Japanese movement is detected south of the ridge line, but no coordinated assault develops during daylight. The line remains under observation, and Marine units maintain readiness for renewed attacks after dark. Fire plans are checked and rechecked. Forward observers confirm prearranged concentrations and confirm alternate communications procedures in case telephone lines are again cut. As darkness approaches on September 14, the ridge sector conducts the standard dusk stand-to. Listening posts are placed forward where terrain allows and are instructed to report movement and direction. The night passes with intermittent firing rather than a massed assault. Isolated contacts occur when small enemy groups approach close enough to be engaged. Grenades are thrown at short range where movement is heard at the wire or along vegetation lines. Mortar fire is used sparingly to conserve ammunition. During the following days, patrol activity increases in the ridge sector as the immediate front quiets. Patrols are directed to confirm whether enemy formations remain south of the line and to determine whether movement is trending toward other sectors. These patrols move during daylight, avoid prolonged halts, and return before dusk. Contact is generally limited to scattered enemy personnel and small groups moving away from the perimeter. Abandoned packs, ammunition, and weapons are found along routes leading into the jungle. Where enemy wounded are located, they are handled according to the security situation, with guards posted when feasible and with movement to the rear only when routes are secure. The Joint Raider Parachutist Force that has held the ridge remains under field conditions marked by reduced rations, humidity, and continuous exposure to shelling and sniper fire. Personnel are reassigned within companies to fill gaps in weapons crews and to maintain minimum manning of automatic weapons. Mortar sections check tubes and baseplates for damage sustained during heavy firing, and machine gun teams strip and clean weapons repeatedly to prevent stoppages caused by mud and moisture. Water distribution continues by canteens and containers moved forward by carrying parties, with consumption controlled by unit orders. Command channels adjust the placement of the Joint Raider Parachutist Force in the overall defensive scheme of the Lunga perimeter. The force has been withdrawn into Division Reserve prior to September 12 and then ordered into a defense line on the southern rim of the perimeter below Henderson Field on September 12, with sporadic contact during the night of September 12 along the ridge line assigned to the raiders and parachutists. During the daylight hours of September 13, while under periodic sniper fire, the units dig in for the night. After dark on September 13, enemy forces launch attacks against the center and right of the line, and by approximately 2,200 the forward estimate indicates that 2 understrength parachute companies plus Raider Company B, less 1 platoon, face at least 2 enemy battalions. Through the night, repeated assaults occur against the ridge position. At daylight the attacks diminish and enemy stragglers are subjected to air and artillery fire during withdrawal. In the immediate period after September 14, Marine reporting notes that enemy remnants withdraw through the broken terrain south of the ridge and move around Mount Austin toward areas west of the perimeter. Marine patrols observe reduced traffic directly south of the ridge compared to the previous nights. Evidence of withdrawal includes abandoned equipment, disturbed vegetation lines, and the presence of enemy dead and wounded in ravines and low ground. Patrol leaders report that enemy individuals encountered during this period are not moving in coordinated assault formations, and that small groups attempt to avoid contact rather than closing with the line. Within the perimeter, the raider and parachute elements are reorganized under pressure of losses and fatigue. Relief and reinforcement are limited by requirements along other sectors and by the condition of available units. The Raider Parachutist Force remains in place long enough for other units to stabilize adjacent sectors and for rear areas to re-establish communications and supply flow. Commanders verify the chain of command down to platoon level, replace casualties among leaders where possible, and assign additional runners to improve control when telephone lines fail. The operational routine during the remainder of mid-September follows a cycle of daylight patrols, position improvement, weapons maintenance, and dusk-to-dawn alert. Intermittent shelling continues. Small arms firing occurs sporadically at night when movement is detected near the wire or along the slopes. Night movement is restricted to essential resupply and casualty evacuation to reduce exposure and to prevent disorientation. Firing discipline is enforced to prevent ammunition waste and to reduce the risk of drawing mortar concentrations onto specific positions. Captured enemy material collected during patrols is forwarded to intelligence sections for translation and examination. Items include documents, maps, and personal papers, as well as weapons and ammunition. These materials are used to identify units engaged and to compare observed enemy patterns of movement with earlier estimates. Prisoners, when taken, are moved to the rear for interrogation as soon as routes permit, with guards assigned from units not required for immediate line duties. By September 20, 1942, command assignments for the Raider Battalion change. Colonel Edson assumes command of the 5th Marines, and the 1st Raider Battalion Executive Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Griffith, replaces him as Battalion Commanding Officer. The Raider unit continues operating as part of the division's available forces, with movements governed by the condition of the perimeter and the requirements for reserves. The battalion's personnel continue to perform security, patrol, and defensive tasks under field conditions as the perimeter remains under threat of air attack and bombardment. In the weeks following the Ridge action, the Raider Battalion remains subject to reorganization and rest cycles as permitted by the tactical situation. The battalion later sails from Guadalcanal and arrives at Noumea, New Caledonia on October 17 to rest and reorganize. The movement is conducted by ship under conditions shaped by the threat of enemy naval and air action in the surrounding waters, with embarkation and debarkation carried out according to available shipping and the priorities assigned by higher command. In the Ridge sector itself, positions continue to be maintained and improved by the units assigned to hold the southern rim of the perimeter. The Ridge line remains guarded because it offers covered approaches through ravines and spurs toward the airfield area. Defensive fires remain registered, and night stand-to routines continue. Patrols keep pressure on the immediate approaches to prevent reoccupation of forward positions by enemy small groups. When patrols encounter enemy individuals or small groups, engagements are short and are concluded by withdrawal to the line before dusk. Daily operations proceed under continuing limitations of ration supply and medical strain. Disease and exhaustion continue to reduce effective strength. Weapons remain in constant need of cleaning due to humidity, mud, and sustained firing. Units continue to move ammunition forward by carrying parties. Mortar and machine gun sections coordinate with infantry leaders to ensure coverage of likely approaches, and artillery liaison remains active to preserve the ability to place defensive fires close to the line when required. Throughout this period, the Lunga perimeter remains under threat of shelling, air attack, and infiltration. The Ridge sector reports reduced large-scale assault activity compared to 12 to 14 September, but maintains full readiness for renewed attacks. Listening posts remain in place each night, and all units stand to at dusk and dawn. Work details continue improving wire and positions during daylight intervals not interrupted by bombardment. Reports and logs are maintained in unit journals and message traffic, recording night contacts, patrol results, ammunition status, and casualty changes as they occur.